This is the Requiem Metal Podcast, Episode 5, Immortal. Welcome to Requiem Metal Podcast number 5, I think it is this time.
I do believe.
We're recording at the witching hour at midnight. I'm Mark Rudolph and
Jason Hundy.
Tonight we're going to be talking about Immortal, and basically we're just kind of, talking about metal in a more academic way than it's usually presented.
It's like car talk, but about extreme metal.
Exactly, except we don't have, callers, but...
Yeah, and I have no knowledge of fixing cars either, so...
But it's that same kind of thing with, trying to take a normally as a accepted lowbrow subject as, extreme metal and... try to have a fairly not academic, but more of a thoughtful approach to it. We're professionals that, we don't just sit around in parking lots with our shirts off, headbanging.
Sometimes,
but
after a Slayer show, maybe.
But so we've had our past is involved with fanzines, and one of us is a teacher, one of us is an artist, so we've got a different approach to the typical metal.
Sure,
as it's portrayed by the media at large with Headbangers Ball and those kind of things. So we're just trying to, we might think too much about Immortal, for instance, but
but it's okay because essentially we're taking a fan's approach, but mixing it with sort of an academic level,
sure,
like you said, and here we are, we're not quite middle aged, but
hopefully we're not middle-aged.
Yeah,
but.
Yeah. We're not as the Silver Jews like to say, the land of middle-aged women.
You're approaching 30s. I'm well into the 30s.
But we have, like you said, we're some professionals. We're not, like crazy tattooed metal dudes out, in the mosh pits and that sort of thing. And we're trying to look at it and give it, sort of a value to the musicality of it and to how it's written and constructed and.
It's not just an emotional outlet. We actually think about this stuff maybe more than we should, but I think it's well warranted how much we think about it. There's really a lot more under the surface to a lot of these bands than what people might think.
Sure.
And especially with a band like Immortal, who's really known. If you drop that name to hipster circles, they're going to think, oh, that guy that tripped in that video.
Yeah, called the Wintermoon video.
Or those guys that have those unbelievably weird photo shoots where you got this kind of chunky guy. Yeah, they're just completely over the top in every single regard. So,
and hopefully, you've been. If you're new to our podcast, you should certainly go back and not to boast or anything, but kind of listen to a few of the other ones where we sort of get a little bit deeper into the dynamics of what our approach is to metal and kind of how to look at certain subgenres and genres. We've mainly explored death metal for the most part, but certainly you'll be hearing a lot of things on death metal, black metal, Finnish metal, melodic stuff, maybe some female vocal driven stuff, some guilty pleasures, maybe bands that are not even metal that have influenced metal,
sure,
for instance. So.
As long as we can make a case for it fitting into some facet of the show, I think a Will Oldham show could work.
Sure,
within
Slint,
sure,
Will Oldham,
sure,
almost like lo-fi influence on we can just do a whole
put it
show
out there that we do listen to all kinds of stuff across the board, and I think it helps. We both, I don't know if we've mentioned this before, but we both come from we both worked at a music store for
sure,
several years, 5+ years, and being exposed to that kind of climate all the time really kind of opens up your eyes to things, but. We always come back to, metal is like one of the...
Sort of the touchstone, the nucleus of sort of
sure,
where we view a lot of other things.
Well, it's the one, I was talking with my friend, Jersey from the Art and Story podcast, he's like, you didn't really even pay attention to music too much until metal came along.
Sure.
I'm like, that's really my gateway to music beyond listening to Hall & Oates on the radio when I was a little kid. So,
mm-hmm. I mean... granted, I'll admit live to our 5 or 6 viewers that my first cassette tape in 2nd grade was Whitney Houston, followed closely by Huey Lewis. But my 3rd cassette tape was Bon Jovi, and from that point on,
I went
it
from
was metal.
Hall & Oates, Weird Al Yankovic to Bolt Thrower. It was kind of a strange. Well, Metallica was thrown in there as well.
Sure,
Megadeth,
sure.
But it was a pretty quick, ascent to metal. So.
And thank God for my babysitter who turned me on to Poison. Told me, Bon Jovi is for wusses. You got to go to Poison.
Right. I had a little bit of Motley Crue detour in there as well.
Yeah, I think everyone did who grew up in the 80s, I guess. But this is the first black metal band, actually, that we're kind of looking at.
And when we say black metal, this might be black metal in quotes, because Immortal is not necessarily known for their satanic imagery, or maybe satanic imagery, but not satanic lyrical content, or really any major content is related to Satanism at all in their music. It's more of a mythical, this cosmic Blashyrkh figure they talk about all the time. They've got a really neat mythology to their music, I'll put it that way.
There's a hint of sort of the Norwegian kind of nationalism, but not the scary kind, but more of like an
not
ode,
the racist kind.
Yeah, an ode to the sort of naturalism and the beauty of the landscape of Norway and the mountainsides and the icy cliffs and glaciers and all these sort of beautiful kind of imagery, the things that Norway's sort of known for from a natural
beyond
landscape.
The fjords and all those kind of stereotypical things, but they really have a love for nature and the raw, just the power of what winter can. What winter is in Norway is completely different than what winter is in the United States.
Sure. Although, granted, we're from Michigan and we've just gone through almost a Nordic winter of sorts. Here, but
we've had our unholy force of evil this winter. But
exactly. But I think there's a handful of black metal bands who may dress the part possibly, but who really sort of stepped outside of it. And I think these are the bands that we'll probably focus on more than any. I don't foresee us talking much about Mayhem on a podcast anytime
and really,
soon,
if you want to know about the really
Yeah.
sensational stuff, there's been a lot of books. There's that I can't even think of the name of it right now. It was that forgettable.
Lords of Chaos.
Lords of Chaos, and there's videos out there from YouTube. There's guys following Gorgoroth around, which is actually pretty interesting. It kind of humanizes the guy a lot, but
yeah.
A lot of the sensational stuff we probably won't really get into. It's more of a musical level. At least for me personally, I care more about the musical aspects than really getting into any of the guys' personal ethics or any of that kind of stuff.
Exactly, and I think I was attracted to that stuff as well. Like I never gravitated towards Mayhem and Burzum and some of the more kind of controversial acts.
Really, I haven't gotten into Burzum until later on, and I can as long as I can come from the aspect of I'm not paying attention to what this guy's saying lyrically. Musically, there's some pretty interesting stuff going on in the first couple records, but
once he starts flirting with stuff that like I care not to hear about in my life.
I don't want to hear any of the
Nazi stuff.
The Nazi stuff's completely ridiculous, but.
So black metal has this sort of tag to it, but there's this handful of bands, like, your Immortals, Satyricons, Ulvers,
Emperor,
even Emperor to really some extent. Even though some of those bands might flirt with maybe the more darker elements of sort of occultism and things like that, whereas as you mentioned before, Immortal sort of stands completely outside of that.
You look at their lyrical content. The only song I can think of that has an outright unholy aspect is "Unholy Force of Evil" off the first record, and to out myself as a complete dork as far as cartoons go, Thundercats mentioned Unholy Forces of Evil for Mumra, so that's as evil as Immortal ever really got,
And it's okay, because we're dealing with heavy metal, and to some extent, even Metallica and safe, so-called safe bands, Iron Maiden had Number of the Beast, and those guys are as normal as they come, they just watch soccer and fencing, essentially. But, Immortal is really kind of even though they have a dynamic sound, you were mentioning they're really kind of a working man's sort of band. They're not
highbrow at all.
They're not Ulver. They're not trying to like do hip hop beats and different things. And
I think what's really made Immortal work is that they've stuck to this really strict black metal format where they're like, okay, well, it works that we dress up in these like really bombastic outfits. And then they've over the years created an entire mythology for themselves, and they don't stray outside that, but they really refine what they've done to like the nth degree. It's unbelievable.
And there's other bands that are sort of like this, like Dark Throne, but I think Dark Throne almost sort of gets trapped in their own sort of circle. They've never, on occasion they'll venture out, but essentially they're just sort of copying Dark Throne at this point and having fun with it, which is fine. Motorhead sort of made a career out of that as well.
Dark Throne's almost like the Sex Pistols of black metal. Like if they do anything different, nobody's going to accept it.
Exactly. So, but getting into who Immortal are a little bit and sort of where they come from, they hailed from kind of one of the centerpiece areas of the whole black metal scene, which was Bergen.
Is that where Ulver? Enslaved, is that where they're from?
Enslaved is from, and Enslaved is another one who kind of operate outside the rules of black metal, like Immortal. But and of course they started as a death metal band, as many black metal bands did. 1989's Amputation, and then kind of reformulated as Immortal. And essentially, Immortal is made up of really two primary individuals.
Sure. I mean, if you really want to break it down, one
who's been consistently there musically, I guess.
Well, lyrically, Demonaz, it's been Demonaz in a bath. And they used to go by Demonaz Doom Occulta and a bath Doom Occulta at some point, but we won't worry with all those
part
things.
of the aesthetic of all this,
But Demonaz was primarily the lyrical writer, and I think he's been actually doing the lyrics all the way from the first record until current stuff, even though he hasn't been on all the albums. But I think Abath's really been the musical kind of focus of the band.
Absolutely. And whereas Abath actually started as the, he's always been the vocalist, and for the first few albums he was the bass player. And then we'll talk about this later. There's sort of something that happens, and Abath has to sort of step into the guitar role, and he not only steps into it, I mean, he really sort of engulfs himself in it and really becomes reinvigorates and kind of imagines the whole band, once that sort of occurs.
Well, and yet he's been the vocalist, guitarist, bass player, and drummer.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, the bass. I think the core of what the band's sound comes from him, and the core of the band's imagery and kind
lyricism.
of like lyricism and mythical elements comes from Demonaz completely. So, and they're brothers, so
yeah.
I'm sure they've been creating this kind of stuff, since they were kids. But.
Yeah, like kind of imaginatory stories. I'm sure that they were kind of telling, and there's the thing I like a lot about Immortal and that I respect about them is even though they can poke fun at themselves and there's some tongue in cheek aspects, it's not as Dark Throne does the same thing, but like Dark Throne sometimes I feel like crosses
Dark
a line.
Throne's like winking at you while they do it. But, but Immortal, they know exactly what they are, and they don't want to stray outside that at all. They do what they do, and that's it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's
something pure about them.
Yeah, and that's where some people don't know how to approach Immortal because I think some people see these kind of goofy photos or something, and are like, are these guys serious? And you actually have to say, yeah, they are, and not in like a the ridiculous way, because with black metal, when it really boomed up in the mid 90s, it had so many imitators and copycat people that it took black metal to literally the most ridiculous extremes that are humanly possible.
Case in point, Profanatica, a US band that tried to take that kind of stigma and the whole like mythos around black metal, and
we can be as extreme as humanly possible.
They took it to a ridiculous aspect that has nothing to do with music or Satanism. It was just retardation.
Yeah, it was pure.
Put it at.
Yeah, it was pure imagery to. I mean, I don't know. It was like a natural born killers of. Yeah. In terms of
it was ridiculous.
Yeah, taking it way too far. Taking some really good ideas and kind of going with it. And Immortal has always been very centered, and that's what's always kind of been interesting about them. And
I mean, Immortal is to black metal what Kiss is to like rock music, I think.
Sure.
I mean, they've got a kind of larger than life persona, and I think if they were just dressed up like normal dudes, it wouldn't have the same, at least live presence. And they've built up this whole kind of like mythos around themselves, and
same with Kiss, really.
Exactly. I mean, and Immortal feels to me like some larger than life like comic book thing that like Jack Kirby would come up with, like this new gods, this whole mythology around their music. They don't try to, they don't have to be hipster and serious, and it's just the complete package right there. If you enjoy it, cool. If not,
sure, absolutely. And luckily for us, they've never had their disco era, like like Kiss had,
or music from the Elder, or anything like that.
Exactly. Why don't you tell us just briefly, because you're a more eminent kind of Immortal scholar when it comes to the when it comes
an Immortal scholar, yeah. I've got the certificate on the wall. And
exactly, it's from the Immortal Institute. But tell us a little bit about the mythology and sort of where they were coming from with some.
Well, it seems to me that it's kind of like a whole. I mean, it's not a worshiping of winter, but it's almost like they're at the mercy of winter. But they bring up these recurring things like there's the Mountain of Might, there's Blashyrkh, there's all these these winter entities that they kind of bring into the.
So these are sort of like almost like a pagan gods or Viking winter gods.
It almost seems like some kind of like weird cosmic thing. Like, and they always talk about time before time. It's all this really primordial kind of thing.
So it's like they're sort of like Tolkien-esque world almost.
And it's interesting that they've started this back on their first record and kind of telegraphed it all the way to the end. And they've always stuck close to that. They've never brought in anything about Satan or killing people. It's always these way bigger events, like these cosmic events that are way bigger than they are. They're just kind of like the guys that are trying to the scholars trying to write this down and tell it to the people
and channel it in.
Sure.
So, And really the first place this shows up is on their debut record, which was put out by Osmos. And we should just mention that Osmos is really kind of the label that really promoted Immortal and really stood behind them and did a lot of really fantastic things.
I mean, they were on Immortal for a good 5 records or something?
All the way up really through At the Heart of Winter.
That's right. I forgot about that.
And even Damned in Black.
Yeah.
I think the only one that is...
It's just Nuclear Blast, right?
Is Sons of Northern Darkness, their very last record in 2002.
And I think Osmos was kind of they were an interesting label. They never really got very big, but they were really devoted.
Yeah.
They had Impaled Nazarene, which no matter what Impaled Nazarene did, they started out being a really straightforward black metal band, but then they did things like Tsunami Finland Parakella, which is it's almost like a hybrid of Motorhead and black metal, which is a fantastic record. Yeah. I can't recommend it high enough. But
Enslaved was another band that they were really behind.
Dark Tranquility, same thing. And they're really kind of progressive label.
Exactly, and French label, but anyways, just worth mentioning.
Kind of the only French label.
Yeah, pretty much. And the first record was called Diabolical, Fullmoon, Mysticism, and one of the things that's sort of always been funny about black metal to some extent is the sort of names of some of the song titles and things like that. And Immortal, like we said, has a little bit of tongue-in-cheek aspect to it, but it all plays into this grandiose mythology.
I think they have a sense of humor. They're not acting like they're Radiohead about being serious about things and being really hardcore, but they're really they stick to their guns, but they don't. They're not so crazy like Deicide to where they're at least how Deicide used to be. Mm-hmm. They don't have this larger than life persona that they try to act tough all the time and like out of makeup. They don't they don't want to be seen as just normal people. Like, oh, I can only be seen in my makeup. I'm a bath. Yeah. That kind of thing. They've been kind of grounded, I think.
Sure. But it's always just sort of been humorous, like I think Dimmu Borgir probably takes it to the furthest extent in terms of like the ridiculous album titles, like how many descriptive adjectives can we get into this?
3 words, yeah.
But yeah, Diabolical Fullmoon Mysticism was the debut, and it was recorded, I think, in like 91, 92. It came out in 92, and it featured a song that we're going to play in just a moment, called Call the Wintermoon, and Call the Wintermoon sort of developed a type of reputation.
Well, it's kind of notorious for, I don't know if I actually saw this video before, the days of YouTube, but it was a very low budget film that they, if you want to call it that.
Film. Scholarly film.
Yeah, it was recorded, they were just running around the forest, kind of like posing, doing the typical black metal stuff, blowing fire and posing with witch hats. And, but the scene that is probably the most notorious is as they're running through the forest. I forget which member of the band is, but one of them trips, and before they actually fall, they cut really quickly. But it's very high school video production kind of aesthetics to the whole thing. But so now it's basically known on YouTube as this ridiculous
it's
video.
Like
but
Kiss Meets the Phantom kind of
Kiss Meets the Phantom at the Park kind of thing.
Exactly. So, but anyways, any thoughts musically on where they came from? We talked about the primary influences is definitely Bathory, without a doubt.
Sure. I think Bathory, and this first record they had a drummer that seems like he has a little bit more of his foot in the whole either hard rock, very mid-paced. It's not like the Immortal we're used to with the breakneck speed stuff. So it almost feels like this guy was kind of held him back to some degree as far as speed.
Armageddon.
Yeah. Who appears later on the I record that came out a couple years ago, which is absolutely fantastic. Yeah. But yeah, the whole Diabolical Fullmoon Mysticism had a real mid-paced feel to it. Had a couple faster tracks, but it stays very mid-paced, similar to how the first couple Dark Throne records were. Not, I'm totally blanking now on the
Soulside Journey and
not Soulside Journey, but
Under Funeral
Moon and
A Blaze in the Northern Sky.
Blaze in the Northern Sky, exactly.
Little mental recall there. It is the witching hour.
It's late.
But certainly, Bathory, especially like Bloodfire Death and Fine Day to Die, this song, sort of one of the centerpiece Bathory songs, you can hear a lot of those elements in the early sort of sound of Immortal, maybe minus the speed that Immortal will later throw in, but, mixed in with a lot of the German thrash metal stuff like Creator, Destruction, Sodom. Yeah. So I think there's this sort of hybrid, and certainly it's there's an unmistakable probably little gloss of Mayhem and Burzum and thrown in there.
I think so.
It was inescapable at that point to not have some sort of influence or
But the thing about Immortal, I think that they weren't trying to be as quote unquote true and trying to be as raw as possible, they actually brought musicality into it.
Absolutely. And one thing we should mention is if you do get a hold of Diabolical Fullmoon Mysticism, a track that we're not going to play, but it's the final closing number called A Perfect Vision of a Rising Northland, has this sort of first kind of epic scope that you later begin to associate with Immortal.
And basically, every album from then on out, they'd have kind of this epic track where they'd slow down and have a lot of reverb and echo on it, and it would just build and build and build. And it sometimes it was the album closer, but a lot of the time it was just kind of like the track right before the end where they just kind of, I don't know. It was just kind of like a standby for them. It was like one of their standards or something you could say. But
exactly. And we'll talk about how that played into sort of the dynamics of their later sound, because essentially it was like a big warm up for their masterpiece, which comes later in their career, where they essentially made an entire album full of those.
I think they had several masterpieces, to tell you the truth. I mean, in all honesty, Immortal is one of my favorite extreme metal bands. I listen to them all the time.
And I mean, pure Holocaust for the new created sort of sound, and then Battles of the North for just taking things to the extreme, which we'll get into.
We'll talk about that in a little bit. But so we're going to listen to cut off the first record is
called The Wintermoon, and then we'll listen to a couple tracks from Pure Holocaust called As the Eternity Opens and the title track, and we'll talk about Pure Holocaust when we get back. So
Lightning to a black and
Welcome back. You just heard Call of the Wintermoon, As the Eternity Opens, and the last song you heard was aptly titled Pure Holocaust. So tell us a little bit about this transition that they make from Diabolical Fullmoon to their second full-length Pure Holocaust.
Pure Holocaust. Yeah, it was kind of the difference between the first Darkthrone record and
Soulside
Journey to Blaze in the Northern Sky, where it was they started out being as a technical death metal act, and went straight to this really raw black metal sound, and it wasn't quite as big of a jump for Immortal from the first record to the second. In
terms of genre leaps.
As far as genre leaps or, content or anything, but Pure Holocaust really marked their, this hyper speed kind of musicality that they're known for now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, it's speedy, but yet there's like again, they're not trying to be as grim or stripped down as some of the other black metal bands that were doing speedy stuff, but like it was almost like Immortal was like trying to like compete with themselves, like, and test their will of how fast we could possibly get this music and still maintain some musical integrity. Sure,
and some dynamicism to the music. They really had. I mean, I think it takes a certain amount of listening to really be able to pull out of this out. And I know the first time I heard Pure Holocaust and their second album, Battles in the North, I thought it was just absolutely ridiculous, really fast, without any kind of rhyme or reason. There wasn't any catchiness to it. But after hearing this stuff for upwards of 20 years, you go back and listen to Battles in the North and Pure Holocaust, and they're incredibly catchy records. There's a lot of subtlety to them, especially. I mean, I think we mentioned this in a previous podcast, but Pure Holocaust has the total Emperor's March from Star Wars in it.
Yeah, hopefully you were able to pick up that thematic element to it,
And as the Trinity opens, it's a really they're really about kind of capturing an atmosphere. I think more than anything, it's this whole like grimness of being stranded in winter, being at the mercy of winter kind of thing. And this is the first album they really kind of pick up on that.
Sure, and to me, it's like the formation of the Immortal sound, and that's why Pure Holocaust is given such high favor. In terms of a lot of people call it they're one of their first masterpieces.
I think it's their first benchmark record, yeah. And this was basically, you got two guys doing this thing too. I think Abath was the primary songwriter. He did drums on the record, did vocals on the record. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's akin to the whole auteur theory with directing.
Yeah.
I mean, when you've got the fewest people mixed into a subject, like look at as far as comics is concerned, Will Eisner or Frank Miller, you got one creative force. Mm-hmm. I think you get more out of that. Same with with movies, you get more of a pure feel of what they're trying to get across.
Absolutely. And one of the things we should say too, kind of about this era of Immortal music, which is really 3 records that sort of fit into this era: Pure Holocaust, Battles of the North, and Blizzard Beast. Is you mentioned this difficulty in terms of like cracking the surface of them in order to how to listen to them, how to absorb what's really happening, because the speed and intensity and some of these other elements that are flying out at you,
the rough production,
exactly, can be really, really distracting. And we sort of equate it to maybe a complex sort of classical symphony where there's like 35 instruments like sort of all happening at once, or especially like free jazz, where when people, I'm sure, first heard, some of Coltrane's later stuff, a lot of it sounded like pure noise, or Albert Ayler, or some of these other
Art Ensemble, a lot of these guys,
Cecil Taylor. I mean, you could go on and on, in the jazz realm. It was, difficult to sort of understand, and even like John Zorn's stuff.
I think it's the difference between a pop record that doesn't require any kind of thought necessarily beyond enjoyment for a listener. This actually requires something for the listener just to kind of dissect what's going on, just to understand what's going on.
Sure. And whereas Darkthrone was making the equivalent of kind of like a Stooges or Motorhead record, which was stripped down rock and roll, like just sort of as raw as we can get.
Yeah, Fenris has even mentioned that they're basically rock and roll at the core. So.
Exactly. They were doing that, and that's why I think people have been able to access maybe more of the Darkthrone sound a little bit easier than maybe some of the more challenging sounds of like Immortal.
Sure.
Whereas like Emperor and Enslaved were almost composing like symphonies in a strange sort of way.
They knew they were being. Yeah, I think Immortal just kind of like they're in this really small, narrow genre that they kind of like these parameters they'd set upon themselves, but without them necessarily knowing it, they just created really, really complicated, not complicated necessarily from a musician standpoint, but from limited roots. I think they really created something really, really fantastic. really, really unique.
Sure, absolutely. And you know, no one else was really playing the style that Immortal was. You know, I mean, I can't think of really any band that's an Immortal knockoff. You know, whereas Dark Throne has hundreds, Emperor has tons, Dimmu Borgir,
Because
Cradle,
like Bolt Thrower, like there's really not a whole lot of Bolt Thrower acolytes. It's the same. It's like nobody can really capture what they had.
Sure.
So.
And one thing that I just want to say now and see if the listeners can kind of like maybe follow this, you know, like Abath's sort of songwriting progressions, because at this point he's not playing the guitar, but he's helping to write a lot of the guitar music. So clearly he knows what he's sort of doing. But when he eventually will take over the guitar, which we'll talk about in the next Talkset, you know, a lot of people have called him the sort of Jimi Hendrix of black metal, because he can take, you know, almost the simplest things and work within a really simple parameter and turn them into these sort of dynamic types of songs and soloing and things like that. But he's never flashy. He's not doing finger tapping. He's not doing, you know, Ihsan, I don't want to accuse, but Ihsan is very technical. And his solos are incredible. In interviews,
he's mentioned that, like, I'll sit around for half the day and just do scales. And you can totally tell that in his solo stuff in the last couple of Emperor records.
Absolutely.
But these guys, they had just this blueprint of what they needed to stick to. They never got flashy, but they got really technical with just adding their simple riffs, but they do like 40 riffs per song, and they figured out how to make incredibly fast, grim, not low production values, but intentionally extreme production values, and make it catchy.
Sure.
Really catchy.
And it's almost like what Kerry King and Jeff Hanneman were able to do with the Slayer sound. I mean, Slayer works within a very like simple parameter, but you know, Slayer's sort of found a way to like make every album kind of have its own personality and even create the fastest songs possible, but then have the ability to create a Seasons in the Abyss or Spill the Blood or South of Heaven.
Has no boundaries kind of song.
Yeah, exactly. That has like a more like, it breathes a little bit, has more of an epic scale to it. But again, even the soloing still plays within that sort of simple parameter. But as a listener, you're caught up in the dynamics of it, and there's something very Slayer-like about every Slayer song.
I'd even say
Immortal-like about
Immortal is
every
very
song.
Similar like to Iron Maiden.
Sure.
They stick to what they do, and they just refine it to the nth degree, and that's what they do. They're not trying to, you know, do some kind of ridiculous like progressive record. It would not sound like Immortal.
Exactly.
And even the I record, you know, that's like almost it almost seems like an AC/DC record of black metal.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's catchy. It's everything Immortal is, but it's just a little bit more rock centric, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's why people have been able to stick with every change that Immortal's done in their career. Like really, like the people who got Immortal were able to follow them through like the major changes, and where like to some bands, At the Heart of Winter, when that album comes out, may have turned a lot of people away. Like you know, people may have felt betrayed as a listener, like the band was changing way too much, but I think to someone who appreciated what Immortal was doing, you feel that sort of flow of change. That
it was a logical progression from it. It wasn't, they weren't trying to do it to sell more records or do this or that. It was like the next logical progression for Immortal, and they've always kind of been along that path. They've never done anything, you know, like we said, never done anything flashy. It's always stuck to their guns.
Absolutely. Now, after Pure Holocaust, we get into the next two records, which I'll let you kind of talk about what happens there.
Battles in the North, which for some people is completely unlistenable. And personally, I've always been enamored by the record. I know some people have just thought it was just kind of mindless noise. It's got, as far as from a production standpoint, they didn't mix it incredibly well. We've got songs that are breakneck speed and it stops dead.
Yeah, really uncomfortable edits and cuts that sort of happen.
Yeah, and at first I was like, wow, they can stop on a dime. But then, you know, later on, you know, knowing a little bit more about how music's produced and everything, you're like, okay, that's just kind of a crappy, you know, just not the best way to necessarily end one of those songs. But so we've got a really raw, abrasive feel for this. But this is the next record where they kind of stepped up from Pure Holocaust, and it's even faster, and the production is a little bit more raw. But if you've got if you can just listen a little bit harder, all the really like rough riffs, they have a really nice musicality to them. They're catchy. They've got there's a lot going on.
Absolutely. In
a song that doesn't on the outset just seems like noise.
Yep. And to sort of, you know, with song titles like Cursed Realms of the Winter Demons and Moonride's Field, I mean, almost like the peak of their, I don't want to say ridiculous song titles, but they're really sort of in this mythological world at this point in a really profound level. And even the cover was whitewashed with just those guys, those figures, kind of in the cover.
Them embracing winter.
Exactly. And one way of sort of describing it, and I'm going to quote here from Ian Christie's complete headbanging history of heavy metal, Sounds of the Beast. I thought there was a really great description. It said the sound had the hypnotic thrill of crushing ice in a whining blender and was possibly the fastest sustained expression of speed ever released. It was surely the most demanding.
And I think it even, not to sound like a highfalutin jerk, but to go back to the whole free jazz thing, jazz hits this, you've got multiple people playing around beats, doing different things along the same kind of structure, but when it all comes together and gels, it swings, and Immortal swings.
Yep.
For all intents and purposes, they get going, so fast, but all these riffs finally come together, and you've got this consistent, almost like you look at it on a oscilloscope, it would be a wave, this constant wave of, it's just.
They definitely find that groove, but it's like a walking bass line, but it's hidden, almost. It's buried in like chaos, Yeah,
you just kind of close your eyes and listen to these things in the dark, and a lot of stuff just pops out. I kind of I'm surprised at what I can hear out of these. Even like you listen to a Dark Throne record, you don't get a whole lot of surprises out of a Dark Throne or Mayhem record, but Immortal's kind of an anomaly in the whole genre, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's what's gave them sort of the staying power and the ability to continue to progress. And it took me a long time to get in these records. I mean, I'll be the first to admit. So if you're a listener out there kind of, tuning into this and it's like, hearing these next set of songs, you're going to hear some things that you probably like and some things that like you're not quite able to wrap your head around yet. But
and we're dealing with the constraints of a podcast. It's 128 kilobits, which is way less than it sounds like on a CD player.
Sure.
So I definitely recommend going out and grabbing some of these CDs and listening to them on a decent stereo,
letting the sound sort of open itself up. And,
sure.
And, you mentioned headphones. I mean, it's a good place to explore a band like this. So,
but the compression that you're going to hear on some of these podcasts is. I mean, it's better than a 56 kilobit thing, but it's still going to be compressing the sound even more, so it's going to maybe sound even more harsh to the first listen. But
absolutely. And now from Battles of the North, they take it really to the furthest extreme that they go with this whole sort of mid-period sound, which is Blizzard Beasts, and kind of a controversial record for some people because some people say it's too fast. And even Immortal sort of admitted that maybe we pushed it a little too much with this record.
I think the biggest fault on the record is it sounds like they went to a producer that's never produced black metal before. Just a guy that's been doing rock records or classic rock or pop music. And he's like, I don't really know what to do with this, so I'm going to know what I know about pop music and try to, dial everything in for you guys. But there's something lacking with the production. But songwriting, I think, is great. It's incredibly fast, and it definitely takes a little bit of a... you get the listeners got to work a little bit to get something out of it, but the Frostdemonstorm,
Nebula Raven's
Winter, Sun That Sank Below. There's some really catchy tunes on this,
and it's interesting because I hadn't heard this record in a long time, and we were listening to it earlier today, and I was surprised as to, it's probably been like 4 years since I sat down and really paid attention to Blizzard Beasts, and I was surprised how much I liked it now. It's almost like. If you give it time to sort of, it's a grower. It really is the growing. So,
to the ultimate degree. This thing, when this thing come out in
96.
96, yeah. So it's like a 12-year gestation period.
Exactly, but it almost fits into like today's era, almost more so. Because I mean, this was coming out in 96, right around the same time that like Enthroned Darkness Triumphant was about to come out, and Anthems to the Welcome at Dusk, and like. Yeah. These really dynamic, well-produced black metal records. And here's this thing, which comes from a band that's not known for being a grim-sounding band, per se, like a Dark Throne or a Mayhem or something. And all of a sudden, like, everything seems like it's boxed, the sound. I mean, it just has this really kind of fuzzy sound to it. Like you said, the production
seems like there's no... Everything's like... It's very tight around it. Nothing has any chance to decay.
Yeah. Yeah, and so pretty interesting stuff. So, anyways, we're gonna hear a couple tunes off of Battles of the North, followed by a song from Blizzard of the Beast, Blizzard Beast, not Blizzard of the Beast. Thinking Ozzy Osbourne here, Blizzard of Oz. We're gonna hear Thrown by the Blackstorms, and your favorite song,
Blashyrkh, Mighty Ravendark.
And maybe, do you want to mention anything in particular special about that tune in terms of this difference of sound?
That kind of picked up where they left off on on Diabolical Fullmoon Masquerade with the last track that it's so small. What is it? Perfect Vision of the Northwinds. It's where they kind of slow down and do these epic tracks where they've got a little bit of, decay and reverb and a little bit of keyboard, and they're just trying to, just kind of build up the momentum of these songs and actually build up to a, crescendo instead of starting with it.
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely.
Thing,
so it's kind of a neat tune, and then we're gonna go with the album closer from Blizzard Beasts, which was Frostdemonstorm, and this is
all one word.
Yeah, all one word. That's look that up in Webster's. It's definitely some sort of descriptive element of a bitchin' weather storm or something. And this is really where the sound changes quite a bit.
Yeah.
Even in the context of like the vacuum of sound that is Blizzard Beast, you can start to hear some different types of guitar riffing and the way that they're organizing and composing some of this stuff. It's almost hints towards the future, right?
Yeah, I think so, totally.
For sure. So, anyways, we hope you enjoy this trio of kind of mid-period, super fast Immortal.
In the earth, I adore
And then you just listen to Throned by Blackstorms, Blashyrkh, Mighty Ravendark, and Frostdemonstorm from Immortal.
And again, in that last song, Frostdemonstorm, you can hear where they're sort of shifting towards a new sound. And I think maybe they took this chance of going to a different producer, like you said, someone who didn't really quite understand. And then I'm sure that, and you can probably speak louder to this because you were sort of dealing with Immortal in that terms. Was there sort of a kind of a negative feedback that came from this record? Where
I think it was just ignored for the most part. I don't really remember seeing much of anything about it at all. To tell you the truth, Battles in the North was kind of this big, it was the predecessor of Pure Holocaust, and people kind of knew what to expect. But this next record was just kind of, it came out on Osmos. It wasn't really well publicized at all, and just I don't really remember hearing anything about it.
Fell by the wayside, really.
Yeah.
So do you think in this sort of atmosphere that was surrounding this record, or the post atmosphere that was happening, that this is what sort of prompted Immortal to just totally try something different, or
between that and then they lost their guitarist Demonaz from tendinitis. It was. Was it in the...
Yeah, he said he couldn't even wash his hair because he had such extreme tendinitis, and a lot of people say it's because he was playing so fast all the time.
And he wasn't playing... I think he was... a lot of people tell you to play with your arm. He was playing with his wrist, I think.
Yeah, and that just eventually got him.
That's going to kill... playing that fast all the time, they didn't play a ton of live shows, but still, even getting to the technical proficiency to record that speed, that's...
Yeah,
that's your wrist moving way too fast in an unnatural movement for way too long. So
for sure, and what ultimately what happened is this sort of negative reaction to Blizzard Beast. This sort of like they tried a new producer, it didn't quite work. They're all of a sudden losing one of the primary founders of the band, who was their principal sort of like guitar player, and all of a sudden it was like a brand new opportunity to try and change things up and really move in a different direction. And we mentioned that they went to Sweden, which was sort of unique for a Norwegian black metal band to go to Sweden to record, and very few did. Only really them and Dimmu Borgir, I think, at the time that
we can think of. Yeah.
And they went to Peter Tägtgreen's Abyss Studios, which was just at that point really starting to develop this reputation for kind of creating. I don't know what you would call it, really warm sounding, like kind of. Well,
epic, I think he understood what the black metal bands were. He understood what they're doing. He knew how to capture it on tape more so than a guy that recorded rock music.
Sure, but he was also very into well-produced records too. Yeah. Unlike one of the old black metal tenets is that
4-track and
in the basement.
Even with there's a story with Ulver with Nathan's Madrigal where they actually cut their patch cord so it's short out.
Yeah.
To get this unbelievably grim sound.
Yeah, exactly. And it's sort of like kind of a cool story, but you can only listen to that stuff for so long. And I think some of these bands wanted to mature and make well-sounding records. And Immortal, when they went in the studio in 97, 98 to cut, at the heart of winter, I think they went in with a totally clean palette. I think that's the first thing you have to know before you hear this, because as a listener who's listening to this, who just got done with our Blizzard Beast Battles in North set, you're not even going to believe it's the same band in some ways.
And I think that Abath took some cues, from Demonaz as far as how he's playing. He kept the speed up, but he changed it wasn't a consistent riffing pattern. It was more, changing it up a little bit more. So you're doing a little more variation. So it wasn't this monotonous riff where you'd get a little bit of catchiness or musicality from it. It was all these little things that made a big whole. And it kind of, I think, the necessity of not wanting to have tendinitis, he kind of figured a way around that, and that kind of, I think, affected his songwriting as well.
Sure, absolutely. And we should sort of mention, too, that this is sort of really where the drummer in this era, who was named Horg, kind of solidifies. Horg had played on Blizzard Beast, and drummers for Immortal are almost like for Spinal Tap or something. They kind of go through a rotation. We didn't even mention Grimm or Eric Colgrim and some of these other guys that they were sort of part of the band on previous records, because it just sort of changes so much. But Horg had been there for Blizzard Beast. I think he had joined right before the recording of it actually got on that record. But this is really, I think, the first one where he maybe had.
Well, you can kind of see his sensibilities more so in this, I think, than Abath was. That's something we didn't mention, but the last couple records, at least from my ear, he's got almost like a novice drummer approach where he's not making the obvious choices that a seasoned drummer might make. He's doing some really interesting things with, instead of doing just like a tom roll, he's doing this just like cacophony of like blast beat with the bass drums, and then doing like a really quick roll, kind of like the thunderous thing that Mayhem used to do, you know?
Yes.
Whereas like the over-echoed thing. He did some really interesting choices that a seasoned drummer might not make.
Sure.
And Horg's bringing a different aspect to and I think making a more full sound and what rounds out the band completely.
It's almost, I don't want to say rock and roll, but it really sort of fits with the type of song structures that they're starting to create.
Yeah, I think he's a better drummer, but he's also bringing stuff that not... You know, he's not making the obvious choices all the time.
And he's simplifying it in a way which works really well for these songs. The record we're really talking about is, you know, I mean, this is the record that drew me into Immortal, and I think drew a lot of people in who maybe had dismissed them as just another black metal band that was playing super fast stuff.
To be honest, it turned me off.
Yeah. And I could see as a long-term fan where this would be, you would have a real...
It took me a couple of years to kind of warm up to this record.
And see, I think I was hook, line, and sinker for well-produced stuff because I was young. I was just coming out of high school when this record came out. So when Dimmu Borgir's Enthroned hit me and then this, I mean, like I was eating it for breakfast. Like, oh, give me well-produced black metal. And then I would go backwards and start getting into some of the more grimmer stuff, I think, on some level. But I think my gateway to black metal was Emperor, which had this fine line between technical...
Which record? Which
In the Night Side, you know.
Okay.
And then Anthems came out pretty quickly after that for me because I heard In the Night Side probably 2 years after it had come out.
Okay.
But, you know, so here I am looking at this Immortal record that came out, and it's just, I mean, it didn't even sound like a black metal record, to tell you the truth. I mean, it sounded like an amazing sort of thrash record. This is where really the German thrash comes to the forefront, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, if German thrash would have operated in a vacuum, this is what it might have been.
Sure. And I think some of the histrionics that Quorthon was able to do in Bathory come out in here.
Yeah.
In particular, one of the songs, the title track that we're going to play, there's some really interesting sort of major chord soloing that we hear later on in the song, and it's just like... It's the same thing you would have heard maybe in like a Fine Day to Die solo, where it's just like explosive and just, you know, all over the place. And this is really where the tag of him becoming kind of the Jimi Hendrix of black metal, I think, comes to form. But you know, At the Heart of Winter has now, I think it's aged very well. I mean, I think all Immortals aged well.
Yeah.
But I think in particular, there's a certain appreciation of what the shift that this record was able to do, not only for a Bath songwriting in Immortal's career, but I think from a black metal standpoint, this is really a line in the sand where, you know, you had the bands that were just going to keep doing what they had always been doing, and bands like Immortal and Emperor and Enslaved were about to take black metal beyond and almost, in my opinion, jump out of black metal. You know,
I've really never thought of Immortal as a black metal band. I mean, they're from Norway. They wear makeup, but beyond that, there's really... I mean, they play fast. Beyond that, that's the end of the similarities, really.
Yeah, and I mean, even like Blizzard Beast, I think even in Frostdemonstorm, there's a lot of Morbid Angel things that are sort of happening in that. And right around this time, too, we should mention, I mean, Morbid Angel, who had always towed this line between, you know, they're definitely a Florida death metal band, but they have these more cultish sort of elements to them that adds a sort of black metal sensibility. I think, you know, Morbid Angel's influence was not only influencing Immortal, but you could say... Certainly, Nine Equilibrium from Emperor, which was coming out right around the same time, was just rich with with Morbid Angel riffing.
I think these guys finally caught up to Trey Zagathoth, or however the hell you say his name, but how he would come up with riffs where they weren't. I think he was at a musical level where he knew how to play standard rock and roll and heavy metal. And he was like, this is kind of boring. What can I do to make this sound more dissonant from a musical standpoint, not from a novice standpoint?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you hear it with At the Heart of Winter. And At the Heart of Winter, it just has so much working for it aesthetically. It's the first and only Immortal record that doesn't feature them on the cover. It's illustrated.
Which kind of bummed me out at first because it's like, you know, it's an Immortal standby. But.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is really sort of I don't even know how you'd put this into context in terms of someone's career. It's the curveball that they throw at the traditional fans, and they expect the traditional fans to kind of understand, you know, where they're going with it, and they hope that you sort of, you know, hang on for dear life.
Well, what I see from as far as their mythical Blashyrkh standpoint here, for all the, you know, the lyrical content, it seems like all the other records are them a journey to this ultimate goal. And now, after this record, they've achieved... Now they're the masters of Blashyrkh. They're masters of the realm. And now that's kind of where their career is kind of going.
Absolutely.
At least thematically for me.
Well, and the title. I mean, they're finally there. They're at the heart of winter. They're at the understanding of what all this mysticism is and this mythology. And I mean, not to get too crazy or academic here, because God knows these guys were probably drunk when they were writing half the lyrics or something.
Sure.
But it is pretty interesting, and the songs all become incredibly epic. And I think I think you can throw the German thrash stuff in there. You can throw the more epic era of Bathory, the Hammerheart, Blood, Fire, Death sort of era. And I think you can also throw Iron Maiden in there in terms of this sort of sensibility to sort of epic songwriting.
Well, we should say all the songs, toe the line between 6 and 8 minutes long.
6 and 8 minutes, yeah. And
some before that, I mean, they were going 2.5 to 3 minutes.
Absolutely, and with an occasional, epic song at the end of a record. But this is where they take those epic songs and they just said, let's fill an entire album with them and just see how far we can sort of take this sound.
Yeah.
And I think, to me, the centerpiece of this whole record, the catchiest song, and the song that when I've played to a younger audience or people who have no context of understanding Immortal, Solarfall has always been really kind of the highlight. And I know people that have seen Immortal say that that's kind of one of the songs that they play that's always sort of a set standard now.
Unfortunately, I've never seen them live.
Yeah, well, I know one of my old roommates had seen Immortal, I think, out east with Chris one time at that New England Metal Festival thing that neither you or I attended. And Immortal played. It was one of the few times they've come to the States, sadly.
I think they've only been here once.
Yeah, and that may have been it. And he said Solarfall was probably the highlight. And I think because maybe maybe some of their faster stuff has a hard time translating live.
I think
sound.
They'd have to have a really good sound man to actually capture that. To tell you the truth, I don't think just the normal guy that's used to doing the round the town metal band or whatever,
Def Leppard
could really understand
Loverboy
what he needs to do to dial this in for people to hear it right, or to mic it correctly or anything.
Exactly, and I think this album really breathes a lot, and I think that's where it's so different. So we're going to hear a couple of tunes off this. We're going to hear Solarfall, which I've already mentioned, and then the title track, At the Heart of Winter, which really has a real epic keyboard intro. I mean, it's almost like kind of Catatonia-like Brave Murder Day kind of stuff. I mean, it's got all kinds of elements really working for it. So we any thoughts on those? Or
this is more your record. This is one that's kind of grown on me. So I'm the aficionado on the first couple. But.
And I was really pleased to see that Decibel kind of gave this credit by offering it up into the Hall of Fame. And I know you'd probably like to see Pure Holocaust or Battles of the North in there as well.
I'm just glad to see them in there at all.
Yeah,
that people take them that seriously. So.
But so enjoy a couple of songs from At the Heart of Winter, Solarfall, and the title track.
to reign, a painting emptiness. Of the dust, survivors of the blood, slowly they move before, behind all time, into the Solarfall. deepest realms I find, with song that's told eternally. For you, a call is ever so dry. Winter landscapes pure and clear, I walk into the glacial valley, deep on earth, forests alive.
welcome back. You just heard At the Heart of Winter, and before that you heard Solarfall from the aptly titled At the Heart of Winter. And it should be mentioned too, hopefully you're kind of enjoying this new era of Immortal and sort of seeing where, they kind of allow their sound to sort of breathe a little bit. But one thing I want to mention is they've been operating for a while as sort of a two-piece because Demonaz had the tendonitis in his hand. But around this time when they were touring for this record is when they recruited the bass player, Iscaria, I think, or Iscaria. Probably Iscaria is how you pronounce it. Yeah. Judas Iscariot or whatever, something on that. And he came in for the tour, and they kind of made him a full-time member, and he ended up becoming...
he was just on Damned in Black, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
No, he was on...
I think he's on both.
Sons of the Darkness, too.
Yep.
It's their longest other member besides Horg.
Yeah,
so
exactly. So
something finally clicked.
And moving on to the last two Immortal records, Damned in Black and Sons of the Northern Darkness, like you said before, it's essentially taking what they had done at the Heart of Winter and kind of just working with that sound, refining. Although to some extent, Damned in Black to me brings back some elements from Pure Holocaust.
I think it's a more catchy record.
You think so?
It's more straightforward. I think they kind of step back a little bit.
Yeah, I would say the same thing as well, and I think that's why some people didn't know how to take it, because I think what At the Heart of Winter did, especially for a person like me, is it was the gateway to the band. Whereas old time fans probably loved Damned in Black because it was like, oh, okay, I'm finally now after 2 years getting used to At the Heart of Winter.
This was the one I actually played more on.
Exactly, because it taking you a while to adjust to all this, but here this came out with a little bit of the At the Heart of Winter sound, but also throwing you some of the old school kind of elements in there.
They brought
as well.
some of the speed back, and
sure. And then really they capped their career off with, I think the people who were diehard At the Heart of Winter fans really loved Sons of Northern Darkness, which was their last record that they did. Now Damned in Black came out in 2000. I
can't believe this is 6 years ago.
Yeah, that came out. And Sons of Northern Darkness was 2002, and that was really the end of Immortal for that period.
Well, until I came out, which kind of whet our appetite until the next
now they've
record.
reformed, and what's sort of interesting,
which is kind of funny because it's basically he broke up with himself, but
yeah, exactly. Because Abath was the one who decided to sort of end the band, and then he decided to restart the band in a way.
And from what I've heard, Demonaz might actually play a little bit on the next record. So
yeah, maybe his tendonitis is healed. And the other thing that's kind of interesting, and I'm not for sure if he's going to stay with them, but when Immortal made these last two records, and then 2002 they toured for Sons of Northern Darkness, which we'll hear a cut from, and a cut from Damned in Black in a second, and then they he broke up and started and he did it with ex-members of Gorgoroth, a guitar player from Enslaved, and he reunited with one of the original drummers from Immortal, Armageddon.
Yep.
And which is kind of cool. It's like, I don't know.
It was kind of like a nice full circle.
Exactly. And it sounds like, for a while you didn't know who was going to come back and play. Was he going to keep him again? But now Horg's come back. So, again, it's, connect the dots, keep track of the drummers. Good luck.
I think it kind of shows how that Immortal's a really tight-niched group. It was him and his brother, or, he could have pretty much picked, with his clout, he could have picked anybody to play on the I record. And they're all Norwegian people, and he brings back a drummer that he hasn't played with for 12 years.
Sure. And it's kind of a cool little statement.
Yeah.
And now they've brought in, too, a new bassist who I think they were kind of did a couple tour dates at festivals with, a guy by the name of Apollyon. And I'm not for sure where he came from necessarily. I know he was in another band per se, but I don't know if I'll be able to find it. Oh, he's from Ara Noir.
Okay.
Which a band I know of, and I'm just not terribly
familiar with, but yeah.
Yeah, it said he toured with them in Australia and New Zealand, and or will be. So
you've got to have a certain amount of stamina to play an Immortal show.
Sure. And I think at first they probably tested him out, and then he kind of came back in. But any closing thoughts on these last two records before we hear some cuts? I mean, every
time I listen to them, I really enjoy them, but when I listen to Immortal, I usually listen to the first four records, or the second through the fifth or something. It's basically everything up until the Heart of Winter. Those first couple, for some reason, really, really stick with me. But every time I go back and listen to these are absolutely fantastic records.
It's almost like two different bands, and you could almost throw into this band is this era as well. It's
Yeah.
almost like kind of caps them, you know.
I mean, I is almost to what Quorthon's solo stuff was, but better.
Yeah, way better,
Yeah.
better for sure. So we're gonna hear, you know, just to kind of close the show out, we're gonna hear the title track from Damned in Black, which it just has a real kind of really super catchy elements to it. You know, almost I don't want to say more catchy than At the Heart of Darkness, but
That's hard to
probably,
win, yeah.
you know. And then we're gonna hear One by One, which is just an absolute. I mean, to me, it almost sounds like what I was. I mean, it really is like the start of that sound that became the I band. But just some really like awesome kind of At the Heart of Winter kind of groove. So enjoy One by One and Damned in Black from Immortal. welcome back. You just heard our closing numbers for the night, one by one, and Damned in Black as we approach the late witching hours now. We're rolling into the AMs right now. Any closing thoughts on Immortal? And I mean, you kind of talked about almost like two different bands, really two different eras.
Well, I think they're a band that they're easily dismissed just by seeing their imagery. And I think they really warrant a second listening or closer listening, especially some of their... I think their later on stuff's a little bit more accessible, but once you've kind of wrapped your brain around that, go back and check out some of those first couple records and see what you can pull out of those. I think there's a lot going on for a really, narrow kind of parameters for what they're dealing with. So
absolutely, and that's I can attest to kind of having gone the backwards route, getting into the catchier stuff first, and then sort of moving backwards, and now kind of gaining a sense of appreciation of the whole catalog of the band and the depth that really sort of is there.
There's not a turd in the bunch. I mean, there's a lot of most of these podcasts that we've done. There's always been kind of a clunker.
Yeah, that we have to skip an album or something.
And really, it's almost come to like a limitation of the listener. From my standpoint, like listening to some of these records that are a little bit on the extreme side, I just couldn't fathom at the time. But with all these years of listening to stuff, go back and listen to them, they really you can pull a lot more out of them. So sure. I really don't think there's a clunker in the bunch.
Yeah, and I would have to agree. And now I'm gonna have to go home and listen a little more Blizzard Beasts and Battles of the North, which records I haven't put on for a little while. So. But we hope you enjoyed this podcast, and if you have any comments or questions or want to give us a lot of crap for what we're doing, or
tell us we're wrong, or tell us that hey, this is something I'd like. Maybe you should talk about this band or this band. We'd love to hear any kind of comments.
Always up for ideas and stuff. You can email us at requiempodcast@gmail.com.
That's REQUIEM@gmail.com.
So for Jason Hundy
and Mark Rudolph,
good night.